Lecture number 12. We will begin on slide 119. The early part of the book of Nehemiah concerns the reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem. And this portion of Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls is the primary concern in chapters 2, 3, and 4, which we will be looking at now. Slide 120. Nehemiah was very concerned about the report that he'd heard from Hanani concerning Jerusalem, its broken down walls and its burned gates. Usually, a person of Nehemiah's position, who was working closely as a servant to the emperor of Persia, usually such people were very careful to hide their actual feelings. Anytime you're working for someone who has the immediate power of life and death over you, you usually are pretty careful about what kind of emotional state you're in and what kind of emotions you share. So personal feelings were usually shielded from high officials. It just doesn't work to your advantage to be grumpy as you're facing a person who can immediately call for your death if he doesn't like what he sees. But in this particular case, Nehemiah was unable to restrain his deep feelings of grief and depression over the state of Jerusalem. So it is still in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, sometime after Nehemiah has heard this report that was described in chapter 1. And on this occasion, when he was taking wine to the king, and as you'll notice a little bit later, also to the queen, the king noticed that Nehemiah looked very distressed. And he said, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." And then it says at the end of verse 2, Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid." Should he actually tell King Artaxerxes what the situation was and why he was feeling depressed? After all, it was Artaxerxes who had issued the stop order to bring the construction of walls and gates to a halt. But finally, Nehemiah decided to screw up his courage, and he requested a reversal of the stop order against reconstruction, and in fact offered to oversee the project himself, just to be sure that there was no suspicious tinge to this project. So he says to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" And so when Artaxerxes asked him what he really would like to see done, with a prayer in his heart, Nehemiah said, "If I found favor in your sight, let me be sent to the city of Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it." Naturally, Artaxerxes wanted to know how long this would take. And so Nehemiah set a date. And it's evident that Artaxerxes had a profound trust in Nehemiah, because he did agree to reverse the stop order, and in fact he issued official documents that authorized Nehemiah to return with army security. Not only that, but to cut timber for gate reconstruction. And so Nehemiah asked and said, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates," this would be the Persian province in the far west, "so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah." Now, this is important because, of course, the Trans-Euphrates officials were very much not in favor of a reconstruction of Jerusalem. And if they caught even a hint that Nehemiah might be intending to reconstruct the walls, they might not have actually allowed him to go there at all, or they might have actually killed him. So he wanted to be sure that he had letters of safe conduct. And so he also asked for permission to cut timber from the king's forest. Of course, all of this belonged to the king of Persia, since he was the emperor, and out of this timber to make beams for the gates of the city. And then you find this recurring expression, "Because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request." So Nehemiah made the long trek to Jerusalem. And not too surprisingly, the officials of the Trans-Euphrates were very upset by the turn of events, especially when they discovered that Nehemiah was there with the permission of the emperor. And so it says, when Sanballat and Tobiah heard about this, they were very disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Jews. Perhaps at this time they didn't actually know how much Nehemiah would contribute to the welfare of the Jews, but they were certainly upset by it. Slide 121. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, after he had rested for about 3 days, he decided to inspect the actual damage to the walls. And so he set out to do this at night. He didn't want anyone to know just what he was doing, at least at this point. And so all of the men with Nehemiah went on foot, but Nehemiah rode a horse. And they did a counterclockwise circuit of the lower part of the ancient city of David to see what the walls were like and what kind of conditions things were in. The map on slide 121 is by the archaeologist Aharoni, and he shows the approximate route that Nehemiah took. And you'll see it in the dashed line with arrows near the bottom of the map, labeled Nehemiah's Night Walk. Some of the points that are described are possibly identifiable. Some of them might not be identifiable. There's some problems with the identification of 2 or 3 kinds. Well, for one thing, there's more than one valley. On this map, you see where it says, right in the very center of the map, you see Ophel. This would be the hill of Ophel. And then as you work your way downward, you see the outline of the ancient city of David. There's a valley on the right and there's a valley on the left. So when the word valley appears in the text, we're not always sure whether it's talking about the valley on the left, which is the Tyropoeon Valley, or the valley on the right, which is the Kidron Valley. But in either case, this is the general area where Nehemiah walked at night, or rode his horse at night, and then apparently got off at some point and continued on foot because the rubble was so difficult. Slide 122. This is an aerial photograph of the same area that was shown in the previous slide in the map. You can see in the upper the upper left of the picture, the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock that now sits where the Second Temple once stood. And then you will see a street on the left side of the photograph that is going downward toward the bottom of the photograph. This street actually is in the bottom of what is called the Tyropoeon Valley. Now, in this photograph, it probably doesn't look like it's a very deep valley, and in fact, it is somewhat more shallow than the one on the right side of the hill of Ophel. But this would be the Tyropoeon Valley, and this would be probably where Nehemiah would have begun his night tour in a counterclockwise fashion. The Valley Gate would be right near where that street was, if we assume that the valley being spoken of in the phrase Valley Gate is the Tyropoeon Valley. Then down near the bottom would be the Dung Gate. That is much easier to identify because the Dung Gate is where all of basically the trash went out from the ancient city of David, and it would have gone down to the Valley of Hinnom, which is where the Jews had their garbage pit. Then the Fountain Gate is more difficult to identify. Here in this identification, we put it on the right side of the hill of Ophel, but some scholars would put it on the left side because there was also a pool over there, which is possibly what might have been called the King's Pool. Again, we don't know for sure, but if this is the pool that was built by Hezekiah back in 701 BC, then it would be the pool that took the channel from the Gihon Spring all the way under the city of David and emptied into a large reservoir that later became known as the Pool of Siloam by the time you get to the New Testament. So at least this gives you kind of a general idea of the geography of what Nehemiah was looking at when he made his night inspection of the city walls of Jerusalem. The valley on the right of the hill of Ophel is the Kidron Valley, and it stretches up and you can, in this place, see more easily the slope of the city of David. And I should mention one other thing, and that is that this photograph is a number of years old. And so if you would go to Jerusalem today, you will see this area much more built up than it is in this photograph. This photograph is more than 20 years old. And so it features a time before some of the area of the city of David was built as much as it is in the modern period. Slide 123. This very small artifact, which is in the British Museum in London, England, is a rare depiction of a Persian horseman. Now, Nehemiah, as you have already noted in chapter 2, does his inspection of the walls of Jerusalem, at least partly, from horseback. And you should also remember that when Nehemiah went to Jerusalem, he was given permission by Artaxerxes to take with him a detachment of cavalry. So the king sent army officers and the cavalry with him, a detachment of the army, and this would be a small artifact that depicts a Persian horseman, similar that you would have found in Nehemiah's time. And it dates from about the 5th century BC, which is about Nehemiah's time. Slide 124. After surveying the rubble of the walls by night, Nehemiah confronted the community of Jews in Jerusalem and urged them that they needed to start rebuilding the wall again. He talked about the vulnerability of the city, that they were in disgrace because of the tumble-down walls, that the fact that there were no gates to protect them meant that they were simply wide open to any marauders who might want to come through. And so he challenged them and he said, let's begin rebuilding. And so they began the reconstruction of what Nehemiah calls this good work. There were 3 officials in the Trans-Euphrates, however, that were very unhappy with this. And those officials were Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. Nevertheless, Nehemiah was armed with an authorization from Artaxerxes. The rebuilding intentions, even though they were opposed by the Trans-Euphrates officials, had official permission from the Persian emperor. And so Nehemiah begins the work, and they start off, even though they are ridiculed by the reigning officials in the Trans-Euphrates region. Jerusalem certainly is surrounded by hostile parties. If you look at slide 125, you will see the 3 major opponents of the Jews. There is Sanballat the Horonite, who was the governor of Samaria, the Trans-Euphrates Persian province to the north of Jerusalem. And then you see Tobiah the Ammonite, who was the Trans-Euphrates Persian governor of Ammon, which is in the Transjordan, to the east side of the Jordan River. And then you see Geshem the Arab, who was the Trans-Euphrates Persian governor of northern Arabia. In fact, Geshem's name is attested in 2 inscriptions from ancient times, one on a silver vessel and the other in an ancient king list. But these 3 names that are mentioned here in the book of Nehemiah have external validation from other artifacts and texts of the time. In fact, one of them I have pictured here, this small tablet, which is an inscription that links Sanballat with the construction of the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. If Sanballat was in fact the leader behind the construction of the Samaritan temple to the north, then it makes sense why he was so adamantly opposed to the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem and certainly the protection of that temple by the building of walls and gates. The erection of the Mount Gerizim temple would have been a rival temple with the second temple in Jerusalem, and so it's understandable that Sanballat would have been very vigorously in opposition to the Jerusalem temple and anything connected to it. Slide 126. So the wall building began. Chapter 3 is largely concerned with the reconstruction of the walls and gates. And as you read this chapter, you will notice that the chapter is narrated in a counterclockwise circuit. So as you work your way through the chapter, you're basically working your way around the walls of the city, but working counterclockwise, starting in the north, moving southward on the left side of the city of David, around the bottom, and then up on the right side of the city of David to come back to where we began at the start. So the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it, set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, the son of Imri, built next to them. And so on goes the narrative all the way through the end of chapter 3 at verse 32. I should say a word about gates, because gates controlled traffic in and out of a fortified city. Once a city was walled, with high walls, and usually those walls would be somewhere in the vicinity of 20 feet or more high. Once those walls are erected, then the only way in and out of the city, at least easily, would be through the gates. And the gates, of course, are built of wood, which is why Nehemiah wanted permission to cut timber to build beams for the gates. Gates were usually flanked by towers, large towers that were higher than the walls, so that defenders of the gates could use archers from the top of the wall to protect against any attempt to breach the gates in time of war. The most vulnerable portion of any kind of fortified city would be the gates, because they were made of wood. They could be breached by battering rams, or if an enemy could get close enough, they could be burned. Fire could be set against them so that they would burn. So defenders of the gates were in the towers surrounding the gates, and the defenders then would produce a withering fire of arrows against any enemies that would come to try to breach the gates. Now, the Trans-Euphrates officials could hardly oppose Nehemiah with force, because not only did he have official authorization from Artaxerxes, he also had a detachment of cavalry with him. But nonetheless, the Trans-Euphrates officials, even though they couldn't officially oppose Nehemiah, they set about to discourage the reconstruction, first of all, by just ridiculing it and making fun of him. In the beginning of chapter 4, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the walls, he became angry and was greatly incensed, and he ridiculed the Jews in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria. "What are those feeble Jews doing?" he asked. "Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" And Tobiah, one of the other Trans-Euphrates officials who was actually there at the same time, also ridiculed him and said, "What are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones." But Nehemiah simply prays, "God, turn their insults back on their own heads." And instead of being intimidated, Nehemiah and his men continued their work straight through. Slide 127. Here you get some kind of idea of the gate structure that may have been constructed by Nehemiah and his men for the various gates. In the lower right, you see actual archaeological photograph of the excavated walls that were once part of Nehemiah's construction. Archaeologist Eli Shukran leans on the wall, so you can kind of get an idea, at least with respect to perspective, as to how large this wall was and how large some of those stones were. This length of wall was discovered in 1999 along the eastern slope of the Hill of Ophel, the city of David, and it is probably part of one of the towers that protected a gate structure. In the upper left of this slide, you will see an archaeologist's drawing of what the gate may have looked like. In this drawing, you'll see portions of the gate that have kind of a reddish tinge down near the bottom of the foundation of one of the towers. This reddish part is the actual area that has been excavated by archaeologists. The upper structure of the gate no longer exists and has long since been destroyed. However, by the way the foundation is built, archaeologists can estimate with a fair degree of accuracy what the gate may have looked like. And this is an archaeologist's sketch of what the gate may have looked like. And you can see the double tower arising on each side of the gate, which served as a protection for the gate itself. Slide 128. On the eastern side of Jerusalem, there is a very remarkable feature of the wall section that is commonly simply called a straight joint. If you look in the very center of this photograph, you will see that there are courses of stones that have a straight vertical joint, and the stones to the left of that joint are of one style, while the stones to the right of that joint are of a different style. The stones to the left of that joint, which have a very smooth surface, are stones that are quite clearly linked to the period of Herod the Great, near the time of Jesus. So they're much later than the time of Nehemiah. This is rather obvious to experts because if you look closely at the stones, you will see that the edges of these quarried stones have what is called a boss, an edging that has been cut into the edges of the stones, and it's most visible in the top edges of these quarried stones. Then on the right side of the straight joint, you find different kinds of stones. These are not quarried nearly so precisely. The surfaces that are external to the wall are somewhat rounded, and this period of construction seems to date probably to about the time of Nehemiah. At least that is the opinion of Kathleen Kenyon of the British Museum in her excavations of this part of the walls of Jerusalem. So the straight joint, where two types of walls meet, would indicate two walls built at different times. The one on the right, built in the time of Nehemiah, the one on the left, built several hundred years later in the time of Herod the Great. This straight joint is about 105 feet north of the southern end of the wall of the old city of Jerusalem, which would be the southeastern corner. And then if you go up from the wall, you will find this straight joint, which is of particular interest to archaeologists because of the different dating of the stones on each side of the joint. Slide 129. Not very long ago, and by the time of this lecture, it was about 3 years ago, or not quite 3 years ago, a fairly sizable section of a 2,500-year-old wall was discovered, as well as a portion of a tower just outside the Dung Gate in the old city walls facing the Mount of Olives. These were discovered by Dr. Eilat Mazar during her excavation, which is ongoing in the city of Jerusalem, and it was dated by pottery at the dig site beneath a nearby tower, along with arrowheads and some seals and some seal impressions, which are called bullae. The wall is probably part of one of the walls built by Nehemiah in 445 BC. You can again see by perspective the person that is standing on the top of the excavated stones about how large these stones are. This is not an especially clear photograph, but it is simply the news photograph that was published in the Jerusalem Post when Dr. Mazar made her discoveries public. Slide 130. This is a model of the city of Jerusalem based on the work of C. Donald Chrysler in a book that attempts to outline the work of the city of Jerusalem and the walls and the various gates. If you look at the very top right of this model, you will see the numbers beginning 1 with the sheep gate, 2 with the fish gate, 3 with the old gate, 4 the Ephraim gate, 5 the broad wall, and so on around the city walls in a counterclockwise fashion until you eventually get all the way up to the very last gate, which is gate number 12. Now, I should say, there is a fair amount of debate among archaeologists about exactly which walls Nehemiah constructed. There's some agreement about some parts of the walls, particularly the parts of the walls that would be where gates 8, 9, 10, and 11 are. But the walls on the left side of this model, gates, particularly like gate 6, the Valley Gate, this is much more debated. Some archaeologists think the wall construction was somewhat different than this. But in any case, you at least get one scholar's idea of how these gates may have looked in the time of Nehemiah and what the city may have looked like. Slide 131. Within those gates, you will notice especially there is one called the Broad Wall. This was labeled number 5 in the previous slide. The Broad Wall originally was built by Hezekiah in 701 BC. This broad wall, which was discovered and excavated by archaeologist Naaman Avigad back in the Jewish quarter of the Old City in the 1970s, is quite a thick wall, which seems to be the origin of its name, Broad Wall. It's about 23 feet wide, and as you can see in this photograph, the photograph on the left shows this broad wall as it works its way through a residential section of the old city of Jerusalem. And then the photograph on the right shows the same wall from somewhat of a different angle. During this time, the city apparently was quite large once the walls were reconstructed, but there weren't that many people living in it, according to Nehemiah 7 and 4. But the broad wall would have been one of the walls that Nehemiah and his men worked on as they tried to rebuild the walls of the city for the protection of the temple and the people living in Jerusalem. Slide 132. On the east side of the city of David, the east side of the Hill of Ophel, there is a remarkable set of archaeological excavations that have revealed several pieces to this eastern wall section. One of the oldest pieces is what is called the stepped stone structure. And that structure may be even older than the time of David. It goes back to the 12th and 13th centuries BC. Now, it may have been used by David and Solomon and others later, but it's a very, very old piece of this eastern side of the Hill of Ophel, a kind of retaining wall or buttress to this steep slope. Then you'll notice that in the left side of the photo, there are two columns and some small rooms, and these are dated to the 10th through the 6th centuries BC. So these sections, these rooms, date to the Iron Age, whereas the stepped stone structure dates all the way back to the Bronze Age. Then if you move to the right side of the photograph, you will see an arrow pointing to a corner section of a structure. And this is dated by archaeologists from the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, the time of Nehemiah and later, the Persian period. If this section is as early as the time of Nehemiah, which some scholars believe it to be, then this corner section that is depicted in this photograph would have been built by Nehemiah and his men in 445 BC. Slide 133. In the book of Daniel, there is a remarkable passage in chapter 9 that says, "Know and understand this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be built with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble." Now, it's well beyond the scope of this lecture to talk about what Daniel chapter 9, verse 25 actually means and what the 7 sevens mean or the 62 sevens. But at least there's a couple of points that you should remark upon. One is that there is the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. This almost certainly has to do with the decrees given by Cyrus and then later reaffirmed by Artaxerxes. And then it says that the wall will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. That certainly is the case for the time of Nehemiah. Nehemiah and his men continue the work, fortified by prayer and at the same time guarding themselves by soldiers and weapons. So as they continue the work, some of them are posted as guards. They have lances, they have bows, they are well armed with swords, and the work goes on unhindered as long as the guards are protecting them. Nehemiah, of course, was warned that it was very dangerous, that the enemies of the Jews could slip up on them unnoticed in all the rubble that was in the valley, and they could get very close because of the rubble gave them good protection. But in response to this, then, Nehemiah divided his men, some of them to be guards and some of them to be workers. And so between the two of them, one's working with their hands to rebuild walls and the other's guarding them from the outside. The work continued. Trumpeters with signals were stationed at various points along the perimeter of the wall to sound an alarm if they were attacked. And of course, if they heard the trumpet sound, then the various workers and armed guards would convene upon that area and they would defend it. Everyone worked with his weapon at his side. In fact, the text of Nehemiah says that even the workers would work with one hand and with the other they would carry a weapon. And so the wall progressed, and the work carried on toward completion. This is the end of lecture 12.